Every map has edges. Beyond the edges is either ocean or the territory of another country. Within the edges, everything that exists is shown. That is what a map is for. Japan has locations that are within its territory, that exist in government records, budget documents, administrative filings, operational reports, facility inventories, that have never appeared on any map accessible to the public. Not historical maps, not current maps, not satellite navigation systems, not the detailed survey maps that Japan publishes for research and planning purposes. They are in the records. They are not on the maps. In this video, we count down 13 Japanese locations in government records that have never appeared on any map accessible to the public. Stay with me to the end. Because location number 1 appears in budget documents going back to 1952, has never been publicly identified, and its operational status has never been confirmed or denied. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us begin. In the interior of Hokkaido, government defense expenditure documents from the 1950s through the 1990s contain recurring budget allocations for facility maintenance at a location designated by a code that does not correspond to any publicly identified defense installation. The geographic description in the administrative record places the facility in a specific valley in central Hokkaido that appears on public topographic maps as undeveloped forest. In Aomori Prefecture, Nuclear Research Administration documents from the Japan Atomic Energy Agency contain references to a subsurface research facility, designated separately from the publicly identified Rokasho nuclear fuel cycle facilities. The administrative designation and budget line have appeared in agency documents for decades. The facility has never been identified in any public agency communications. Rokasho appears on maps. The second designation does not. In administrative records held by the Ministry of Health's post-war public health assessment offices, documents from the American occupation period reference a former wartime research facility in the Osaka-Kyoto corridor that was assessed for decontamination in the late 1940s. The facility is referenced by a wartime designation that does not correspond to any installation in the publicly available documentation of Japan's wartime biological and chemical research programs. The decontamination assessment records describe the facility's location with sufficient specificity to place it in a particular area of the corridor. That area appears on public maps as ordinary residential and commercial development from the post-war period. The decontamination records have been partially declassified. The facility designation they reference has not been publicly identified. The land above the former facility's described location has been developed without acknowledgement of the assessment records. In Japanese Maritime Safety Agency, administrative records from the 1950s, a small island formation in the waters south of Okinawa is referenced in navigational hazard assessments and fishing zone administrative documents by a designation that does not appear in any publicly available Maritime Safety Agency publication from the same period or subsequently. The formation is described in navigational terms, sufficient to place it in a specific area of ocean south of the main Okinawa Islands. That area of ocean appears on all public navigational charts as open water with no island or reef formation. Japanese fishing vessel operational logs from the same period and from subsequent decades contain references to navigating around a formation in the designated area. The formation appears in operational logs. It does not appear on the navigational charts those vessels were required to carry. The vessels navigated around something that the charts said was not there. In Tokyo, metropolitan government infrastructure maintenance documents, recurring budget allocations, reference a water storage facility designated separately from the publicly documented Tokyo Water Supply Infrastructure Network. The designation appears in maintenance budgets, in emergency water supply planning documents, and in civil engineering coordination records from the 1960s through the present. The publicly documented Tokyo water supply infrastructure is extensively mapped. The reservoirs, treatment facilities, distribution networks, and emergency storage systems are available in planning documents and public utility maps. The separately designated facility does not appear in any of these public documents, despite appearing consistently in the maintenance budget records. Emergency water supply planning documents from the 1990s reference the facility's capacity and calculations for post-earthquake water provision. The capacity figures used in those calculations exceed the combined capacity of all publicly documented emergency water storage facilities in the metropolitan area. The additional capacity comes from the separately designated facility that does not appear on any public map. In American military administrative records transferred to Japanese government custody under the terms of the 1972 Okinawa Reversion Agreement, specific facility designations appear that do not correspond to any installation in the public documentation of American military presence in Okinawa during the occupation period. The designations reference facilities whose operational parameters in the American records suggest functions different from the publicly documented base activities. The specific function designations use classification codes that the declassified American military records of the period associate with activities not acknowledged in the public narrative of American military operations in Okinawa. Japanese government records that reference these facilities in the context of the reversion agreement. Negotiations contain the same designations. The negotiations produced the reversion. The facilities designated in the negotiation records were not identified in the public documentation of what was being transferred. They are in the negotiation records. They are not on any map of what was transferred. In Japan, Meteorological Agency operational records, a seismic monitoring network coordination facility in the Nagano mountain region, is referenced by a designation that does not correspond to any publicly identified monitoring station in the agency's public network documentation. The facility appears in internal coordination documents as a data aggregation point for a specific cluster of monitoring stations whose individual readings are processed at the designated facility before transmission to the public network. The processing step at the designated facility is referenced in technical documents that describe the data modification applied before public transmission as a calibration procedure. The specific calibration parameters described in the technical documents produce output that differs from raw seismic readings in ways that are not explained in the agency's public methodology documentation. The designated facility exists in operational records. Its location is described in those records. It does not appear on any public map of Japan's seismic monitoring network. In Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force operational planning documents, a specific corridor in the Japan Sea is designated for underwater vehicle testing and evaluation operations. The corridor designation appears in fleet operational planning records, in maintenance scheduling documents for underwater test equipment, and in coordination records with the Japan Coast Guard for surface exclusion during designated operational periods. The publicly available maritime zones documentation for the Japan Sea does not include the operational corridor designation. Navigational charts for the area show no restricted zone corresponding to the corridor's described position. Coast Guard coordination. Records reference surface exclusion periods in the area, without the exclusion appearing in any public navigational advisory for the same periods. Civilian fishing vessel. Operators in the area have documented unexpected surface exclusion, enforcement in the corridor zone during periods not corresponding to any publicly announced exercise or restriction. In Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry records from the post-2011 Fukushima accident period, remediation planning documents reference a specific zone adjacent to the publicly designated exclusion areas that was assessed for contamination levels, requiring a remediation approach distinct from the publicly documented decontamination program. The zone designation in remediation planning documents does not correspond to any of the publicly designated exclusion or restricted zones established following the accident. It appears in internal planning documents as a separately assessed area whose contamination characteristics required distinct management. The management approach described in the internal records differs from the approach applied to publicly designated zones. The zone has not appeared in any public communication about the Fukushima remediation program. The remediation records that reference it have not been included in the public documentation of remediation activities. People who lived adjacent to the zone were relocated under the publicly designated zone program without the separately assessed zone being identified. In Kyoto City archaeological and civil engineering coordination records, recurring references appear to a subsurface tunnel system that predates the modern city and was documented during various construction and excavation projects from the 1950s through the 1990s. The documentation is in engineering coordination records that were filed when construction projects intersected with the tunnel system and had to be adjusted to avoid or bridge it. The tunnel system is referenced in these coordination records with sufficient consistency to establish its approximate extent and routing through the subsurface of the historic city center. It does not appear on any public archaeological map of Kyoto, on any city subsurface infrastructure map, or in any publicly accessible historical documentation of Kyoto's subsurface features. The coordination records establish that its existence was known to multiple construction firms, city engineering offices, and archaeological consultants over 4 decades. None of them have publicly documented it. In Japan Air Self-Defense Force, logistics and maintenance records, a facility in the Mount Fuji region is referenced by a designation that does not correspond to any publicly identified JOASDF installation in the area. The facility appears in maintenance scheduling documents, in personnel assignment records showing rotational staffing, and in logistics coordination records for equipment and supply delivery. The publicly documented JASDF installations in the Fuji region include the Nyutabaru Air Base Complex and associated facilities. The separately designated facility appears in logistics and maintenance records as a distinct location, receiving its own maintenance cycles, personnel rotations, and supply deliveries independent of the documented installation network. Tourism and hiking documentation for the Mount Fuji region, including detailed trail maps and official Park Service materials, covers the area described in JASDF logistics records as the facility location without acknowledging any military installation. The hiking maps are detailed. The facility is not on them. In Tokyo Metropolitan Government, administrative records, budget documents, and infrastructure coordination filings, a geographic designation appears that does not correspond to any ward, district, or administrative division in Tokyo's publicly documented administrative structure. The designation appears in budget allocations for public services, in infrastructure maintenance coordination, and in emergency response planning documents. Tokyo's administrative geography is among the most thoroughly documented in the world. The 23 special wards, the cities, towns, and villages of the metropolitan area are mapped, described, and publicly administered with extraordinary detail. The separately designated area appears in administrative records alongside the documented divisions as if it were a recognized administrative unit receiving public services and emergency planning consideration. It is not in any public description of Tokyo's administrative geography. The services it receives are budgeted. The budget is public. The designation that receives those services is not mapped anywhere a member of the public can access. The location that has appeared in Japanese government budget documents since 1952, that has never been publicly identified, whose operational status has never been confirmed or denied, and that has never appeared on any map accessible to the public, is designated in budget records by a code that has remained consistent across 7 decades of government budget documentation. The code appears in documents from the occupation period. It appears in documents from the immediate post-war recovery period. It appears through the decades of Japan's economic growth. It appears in contemporary budget documents. The budget allocation associated with the code has varied, sometimes larger, sometimes smaller, never zero. The operational continuity implied by a non-zero budget allocation maintained without interruption since 1952 is the most specific information publicly available about this location. What it is, where it is, and what has been happening there since 1952 has never been published. The budget line continues. The location remains off every map. And whatever is there has been funded without interruption for over 70 years.